4:17 in the morning. A steel door groans open 200 meters under a mountain ridge, and the first inspector's flashlight catches a hallway that isn't supposed to exist on any declared floor plan. No windows, no markings, just raw rock reinforced with fresh concrete that still smells faintly of curing agent. This is not a rumor circulating on a forum somewhere. This is not a blurry satellite photo blown up and argued over by amateur analysts on social media. This is a physical, on-the-ground inspection with a paper trail, a time-stamped access request, and multiple officials briefed within hours. What inspectors found down there is not a storage room. It is not a bunker in the casual sense most people picture when they hear that word. It is a fully operational extension of the enrichment chain, buried deep enough to survive almost any strike, short of a weapon purpose-built to reach it. I'm going to walk you through exactly what was found, why this specific location was always the real center of gravity in this entire standoff, and why what unfolds over the next few weeks is going to matter more than anything we've covered on this channel so far. Stay with me for all of it. Before we go any further, I want to be straight with you about what I actually know here, because that matters more to me than sounding dramatic. Some of what I'm walking you through is confirmed, drawn directly from inspection reports and satellite data that corroborate each other. Some of it is reported by more than one outlet, but not yet independently verified, and I'll say so when we get there. And some of it is my own professional read on how these pieces connect, built on years of watching this exact pattern unfold in other countries, under similar pressure. I'll flag which is which as we go, because you deserve that distinction. No hype, no speculation dressed up as fact. Let's get into it. To understand why this particular site matters, you first have to understand how a modern enrichment program actually functions, because almost nobody explains this part clearly, and it changes everything about how you read the news that follows. Enrichment is not one machine sitting in one room waiting to be switched off. It is a chain, link by link, and every link depends completely on the one before it. First, you need a source of raw uranium ore. Second, you need a conversion facility that turns that ore into a gas form suitable for processing. Third, you need a cascade of centrifuges, spinning that gas at extraordinary speed to separate the isotope you want from the ones you don't. Fourth, and finally, you need a stockpile facility to hold the enriched product once it's ready. Sever any one of those 4 links, and the rest of the chain stalls immediately. Cut the conversion stage, and the centrifuges have nothing left to spin. Cut the centrifuges themselves, and the stockpile simply stops growing no matter how much raw ore sits in storage. This is exactly why airstrikes against a single above-ground building rarely end a program the way most people assume they will. You are not destroying a factory in the way you'd picture destroying a car plant. You're trying to sever one link in a chain that the other side has spent years quietly building redundancy into. And here's the recontextualizing piece almost nobody talks about, the fact that flips how you should be reading every headline on this topic. Most people assume the real danger of a program like this is the sheer number of centrifuges spinning at any given moment. The bigger the number, the scarier the story. It isn't. The metric analysts actually track. The one that determines how close a program is to weapons capability is enrichment percentage, not centrifuge count. Uranium enriched to even 20% has already cleared most of the technical difficulty on the road toward weapons-grade material. The remaining jump, from 20% up to 60%, is far smaller in raw engineering terms than the jump from natural uranium all the way up to 20% in the first place. That's a genuinely counterintuitive fact, and it's the single most important thing to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. Depth matters here for a very specific reason, and it isn't just protection from a strike. A facility buried under 200 meters of solid rock is also nearly impossible to monitor continuously from the outside. Above-ground facilities can be watched by satellite, thermal imaging, even acoustic sensors, picking up centrifuge vibration through the walls. Deep underground, almost none of that works reliably, which means enrichment percentage can climb quietly for long stretches without the outside world having any real-time way of knowing exactly where it stands. That gap in monitoring capability, not the depth itself, is the actual danger. Think about the difference between watching a pot on a stove and watching a pot inside a sealed oven with no window. Above ground, analysts can at least see the steam rising, so to speak. They can infer activity from indirect signals, even when they can't see the process directly. Underground, at this depth, even the indirect signals mostly disappear. Ventilation shafts become one of the only remaining tells, which is exactly why the earlier flagged patterns we'll get to in a moment turned out to matter as much as they did. Analysts have learned to read cooling systems, power draw, and shaft placement almost like a stethoscope pressed against a wall they can't see through, because it's often the only instrument they've got left once a program moves this far underground. There's also a third layer to this that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Depth doesn't just protect the facility from strikes and from monitoring, it also changes the calculus around inspection access itself, because sending a team 200 meters underground is logistically and physically a different proposition than walking into a ground-level warehouse. Air quality, structural stability, communication equipment that doesn't function reliably through that much rock, all of it slows down the process of actually confirming what's down there once access is finally granted. So even after this week's breakthrough, full technical verification is likely to take considerably longer than the initial discovery did. That's the mechanism in short form. Depth breaks the outside world's ability to watch the chain in real time. Here's the longer version, and the one that actually explains an entire decade of diplomatic frustration around this program. Every round of negotiations, every inspection framework, every sanctions package built since the original deal collapsed has rested on one core assumption: that inspectors could verify enrichment levels with reasonable confidence through declared, accessible sites. And every single time a new deep-buried extension gets confirmed, like the one this week, that foundational assumption takes another direct hit. Diplomats aren't just negotiating over centrifuge counts anymore. They're negotiating over whether they can trust their own visibility into the program at all, and that's a much harder problem to solve at a table. Think of it this way. Negotiating over a number, how many centrifuges, how many kilograms of enriched material, is fundamentally a negotiation over quantities you can eventually verify with the right equipment and the right access. Negotiating over trust in a monitoring system is a completely different category of problem because trust isn't something you can measure with a sensor. It has to be rebuilt incident by incident, and every new undeclared extension that gets discovered resets that rebuilding process back to close to zero. That's the quiet, structural reason this single discovery carries more diplomatic weight than its physical size alone would suggest. Now let's talk about how this actually unfolded, because the sequence here matters just as much as the discovery itself, and almost none of the mainstream coverage got the order of events right. Roughly 9 minutes after inspectors formally requested access to a maintenance corridor flagged during a routine satellite pass the week before, facility staff on site reportedly attempted to redirect the inspection team toward a different section of the complex entirely, one that had already been cleared in a prior visit. On its own, that's not necessarily alarming. Redirects happen for mundane reasons all the time: scheduling conflicts, safety protocols, ongoing maintenance. Experienced inspectors know this too, which is exactly why the first redirect alone didn't trigger an escalation. It's the pattern that follows a redirect, not the redirect itself, that tends to separate routine friction from something worth pushing on. But roughly 90 minutes later, according to two people briefed directly on the visit, the inspection team held firm and insisted on the original corridor, citing treaty language that guarantees unannounced access to any formally declared site. And here's the piece almost nobody's explaining correctly in the coverage you've probably already seen. This was not some secret facility stumbled onto by accident. It was a declared site, one that had been inspected before under the existing framework. The corridor that led down into the deeper structure, the one that wasn't on any prior floor plan, was not declared. That distinction, declared site with an undeclared extension, is legally and diplomatically a completely different animal than a secret facility built entirely off the books. And it's going to shape everything about how this gets handled in negotiations going forward. A wholly secret facility is, in a strange way, the simpler diplomatic problem, because its existence alone is an unambiguous violation with little room for argument. An undeclared extension attached to a site that was otherwise cooperative and accessible sits in murkier territory. And murkier territory is exactly where prolonged negotiations tend to live the longest, because both sides can construct a defensible version of events without either one being straightforwardly wrong. There are 3 separate tracks worth pulling apart here, because they moved on 3 different clocks and get collapsed together into one confused timeline in most of the coverage circulating right now. Track 1 is the technical track, inspectors on the ground working through access protocols hour by hour, document by document, corridor by corridor. Track 2 is the diplomatic track, where officials in at least 2 capitals were reportedly notified of the find within the same 24-hour window, well before any public statement was drafted or released. Track 3 is the intelligence track, running quietly underneath the other 2 for months. Satellite imagery analysts had apparently flagged unusual ventilation patterns at this exact location well before the inspection ever happened, patterns consistent with a much larger underground footprint than what had been publicly declared to the outside world. 3 tracks, 3 very different timelines, and they only converged into a single public story this week. It's worth slowing down on that intelligence track for a moment, because it's the piece that quietly explains why this discovery didn't come as a total surprise to people who follow this closely, even though it's being covered as a shock development everywhere else. Unusual ventilation patterns don't just appear overnight. Analysts had apparently been tracking incremental changes in shaft placement and thermal signature over a period of months, small enough on any single pass that they wouldn't justify a public statement on their own, but consistent enough over time to build a pattern. That's how a lot of this work actually happens. Not one dramatic photo that proves everything at once, but a slow accumulation of small anomalies that eventually cross a threshold where someone decides it's worth requesting physical access to check. This latest inspection is that threshold being crossed, not a bolt from nowhere. This is worth remembering the next time a story like this breaks somewhere else in the world, because the pattern repeats almost every time. The public version of events always looks sudden. The underlying version, the one built from months of small, unremarkable data points stacking quietly on top of each other, almost never is. And once the corridor was confirmed, the sequence of internal notifications reportedly moved fast by diplomatic standards. Within the same day, before any public statement existed, officials in multiple capitals were already coordinating on how to respond, which tells you something important on its own. When information moves that quickly through diplomatic channels before it moves publicly, it usually means the people involved already understood the stakes well before the story broke, and had likely gamed out several response scenarios in advance, rather than reacting cold. If this breakdown is giving you the kind of context you genuinely can't find anywhere else, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell, because this story is moving fast, and I'll be covering every real development as it happens, not just recycling the headline version everyone else is running with. So let's zoom out, because a discovery like this never stays contained to a single inspection report for long. It escalates outward in stages, and each stage is a direct downstream consequence of the one before it, never a lateral jump to some unrelated headline. At the local level, the immediate consequence is diplomatic friction over access rights, because a declared site with an undeclared extension is technically a violation of the exact monitoring framework that's kept this program under any outside oversight at all for years. At the national level, the consequence turns political fast. A government now has to choose between granting expanded access, which reads as capitulation to a domestic audience already skeptical of outside interference, or restricting access further, which invites precisely the sanctions response it has spent years maneuvering to avoid. At the regional level is where this genuinely gets volatile, because neighboring states have built their entire security posture around assumptions about exactly where this program actually stands, technically. A confirmed deep enrichment extension changes that calculation immediately, and history shows regional responses tend to cluster into three recognizable patterns. Some governments push harder for renewed diplomatic pressure, hoping to pull the temperature back down before anything worse happens. Others quietly accelerate their own defensive capabilities in the background, because deterrence only functions if the other side genuinely believes you're capable of responding. And a smaller but louder group start talking, sometimes publicly and sometimes only in closed-door briefings, about preemptive options, which remains the single most dangerous phrase anywhere in this entire story. It's worth being specific about why that third pattern is so dangerous, rather than just naming it and moving on. Preemptive language, once it enters official channels, changes the incentive structure for everyone involved almost overnight. It signals to the other side that the window for a diplomatic resolution may be closing, which in turn creates pressure to accelerate rather than slow down, since slowing down starts to look like a strategic mistake if the other side genuinely believes a strike is being seriously considered. That's the mechanism behind almost every escalation spiral in this region over the last 2 decades. Not one side deciding unilaterally to attack, but both sides independently concluding that time is running out and racing each other toward a deadline that may not have even existed until the language itself created it. There's a second-order effect worth naming here too, one that plays out away from the headlines entirely. Defense procurement decisions made by neighboring governments in the weeks following a discovery like this rarely get reversed, even if tensions cool down afterward. Once a government commits budget and political capital toward accelerated defensive capability, that commitment tends to become permanent infrastructure, not a temporary response. So even in the scenario where this particular story de-escalates within a month, the regional security posture it triggers along the way often outlives the story itself by years. That's the pattern worth watching for over the coming months, not just the headline reaction in the next few days. The loudest response usually arrives fast and fades fast. The quiet response, budget lines shifted, procurement contracts signed, defensive infrastructure expanded, moves slower and sticks around far longer, and it's almost never covered with the same attention as the initial discovery that set it in motion. At the global level, markets reacted within hours, not days. Energy prices ticked upward almost immediately on the news, and at least one major oil-producing state's currency moved enough to draw attention from traders who don't usually track enrichment politics closely at all. This is the exact same pattern we broke down in our last analysis on the straight choke point standoff, if you remember that one. Markets don't wait around for official confirmation before they move. They price in probability the second a credible headline drops, and that's precisely what happened again here, almost beat for beat. There's also an institutional layer sitting underneath the market reaction and the government statements, one that gets far less attention than either of those. Multilateral bodies built specifically to manage exactly this kind of situation now face a credibility test of their own. If the existing framework can't reliably catch an undeclared extension on a site it already had access rights to, that raises uncomfortable questions about what else might be sitting undetected elsewhere, not just at this one location. Other member states watching this unfold aren't only reacting to what happened here. They're quietly reassessing how much confidence they can place in the entire verification system going forward, and that erosion of institutional trust tends to outlast any single news cycle by a wide margin. It shapes how the next negotiation gets structured, how aggressively the next set of access demands gets written, and how much patience anyone has left for incremental diplomacy the next time a similar flag gets raised. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further, because it's easy to get pulled entirely into the tactical detail of a story like this and lose sight of the human center underneath it. Behind every line item in an inspection report, there are engineers, technicians, and families living inside a country under enormous, sustained pressure, people who never chose the geopolitics they now find themselves caught inside of. Understanding the strategic stakes here doesn't require pretending the human cost of prolonged sanctions or the real risk of conflict isn't equally real. Both things are true at the same time. You can take this seriously as a security story and still hold on to the fact that ordinary people are the ones absorbing the weight of decisions made far above their heads. I think about this every time a story like this crosses a threshold the way this one did this week. It's easy, from the outside, to talk about enrichment percentages and access corridors like pieces on a board because that language is precise and it's useful for understanding the mechanics. But precision isn't the same thing as the whole picture. Sanctions regimes tighten around entire economies, not just around the specific facilities they're meant to pressure, and the people who feel that tightening first are rarely the ones making the decisions at the top. That's not an argument for any particular policy position. It's just a reminder, to myself as much as to you, that the stakes here were never purely technical, even on the weeks when the coverage makes it sound that way. The corridor, the ventilation shafts, the enrichment percentages, all of it matters, and I'll keep breaking it down for you exactly as it develops. But it sits on top of something much simpler and much harder to solve with a treaty clause, which is that the people living closest to this story rarely get a vote in how it unfolds. Here's where we stand. A declared facility turned out to have an undeclared extension buried 200 meters down, discovered only after inspectors pushed past an attempted redirect and insisted on the access they were legally entitled to. What they found down there wasn't a bunker in the casual sense of the word at all. It was a working piece of the enrichment chain, hidden specifically because depth breaks the outside world's ability to monitor it in real time. And that monitoring gap, more than any single number or centrifuge count, is the actual reason this story matters more than anything else we've covered on this program in recent memory. If this gave you a clearer picture than you'd get from a 30-second panic clip, share it right now with someone who's actually trying to understand what's happening here instead of just scrolling past the scariest version of the headline. And I genuinely want to hear from you on this one. If you were the one sitting in the room where the next access decision gets made, tighter inspection demands, or a diplomatic off-ramp, which path do you think actually lowers the risk of this escalating further, and why? Drop your take in the comments below. I read every single one and hit like if this analysis delivered real value to you today. There's more coming on this story, and soon. The next round of access talks is expected within days, and depending on how that goes, this either cools back down into the background noise of ongoing diplomacy, or it becomes the center of gravity for everything else happening in the region right now. Watch the language coming out of those talks closely, because it tends to tell you more than the headlines summarizing them ever will. If negotiators start talking about expanded permanent access rather than a one-time inspection, that's a signal toward de-escalation. If the language instead starts drifting toward deadlines and consequences, that's the signal to pay much closer attention. And if you hear officials on either side start invoking military options, even hypothetically, treat that as the moment this story shifts from a diplomatic dispute into something with a genuinely different risk profile altogether. I'll be tracking exactly that shift for you, and I'll be here the moment it moves. Stay close.